with your name, the year of the mock convention, and the role you may have played there.
I'm Louis John, class of 1958 at Washington and Lee, and my mock convention year when I was an undergraduate student delegate. Famous one with Alvin Barkley, but I was since then have been to, I believe, attended 13 of the 15 mock conventions because I've been and have retired here. I was a member of the politics department until 1990, was also dean of students from 1969 to 1990 until retirement in 2006. So a number of mock conventions, participated only in my undergraduate one.
That's great. Well, let's talk about 1956 for a minute. Specific memories you have. Was it crowded? I've heard that it was hot inside. Just sort of set the scene for us before the incident and during.
In terms of my particular undergraduate mock convention, which was 1956, it was held in late April, or actually in early May, because it was postponed for a week after Barkley's death. But it was hot. It was a large crowd, and I would say not a hostile crowd initially, because Senator Alvin Barkley, who had been vice president, of course, was the keynote speaker that year. But it was the first Democratic convention, Democratic Party convention in 24 years. Eisenhower was the president at the time, and the keynoter, as I mentioned, was Kentucky Senator Alvin Barkley, who was vice president under Harry Truman. So as the first Democratic convention, and in terms of a conservative, very Republican-oriented student body, the students who served as delegates were not overly receptive initially, I think you might say. In the words of one observer, he gave the Republicans hell, but initially to a lukewarm reception. And I remember him saying at the time, "Well, you want me to tell you the truth, don't you?" And so he was known as a polished, fiery orator. He had been the keynote speaker in 1948, I believe it was, at the Democratic Party convention in Philadelphia. And he told delegates that while he had not planned to attend the Democratic convention later that summer, and that he was going to attend the convention, said something to the effect that this old fire horse has heard the bell. And with that, the delegates, I guess you could say erupted would be one way to describe it. And as they interrupted him talking with that phrase, they did so about 10 times, I think, to applause during his speech, which, as I said, was a blistering attack on the Republican Party, as you might gather, mixed in with lots of humor, occasionally salty, perhaps. But at one point, I remember he inadvertently knocked over a microphone, and his comment after that was to the effect, "That's nothing what will happen to the Republicans in November." And he joked with the delegates, telling them that it wasn't until he really scanned the room and saw signs displaying just about every Democrat's name because of the nature, except Barkley. He realized, he said, that he would never be a presidential candidate. Of course, he was 78 years old, I believe, at the time. And so he replied, somebody said, "Come on, you old fire horse," and he said that, replied that all fire apparatuses now are now automotive and not horse-drawn. So he was content with his role as a junior senator from Kentucky. "I'm glad to sit in the back row," I remember him saying, and that led up to what is probably the most famous exit line that would be possible, for he said, "I would rather be a servant in the house of the Lord than to sit in the seat of the mighty." And with that, with this very dramatic exit line, he suddenly collapsed, fell. The students, because nobody knew initially just how serious it was and what had happened. Some thought that he had just perhaps knocked over another microphone. But many believed he had fainted, perhaps as a result of the oppressive, and it was about 90 degrees, I remember, in the gym in Doremus where this was held. But there was a local doctor, Dr. Bob Munger, and the Lexington life-saving crew administered oxygen for some minutes, but they thought he had probably died before he hit the floor as a result of a massive heart attack. So about an hour later, the mayor of Lexington, who was Paul Holstein, later a judge in town, announced his death to, there were approximately 1,700 total people, I think, packed into the gym on that day, and it had remained hushed, as you might gather, since the collapse, and requested a minute of silent prayer. So the news, and so the convention was adjourned indefinitely, and I can just remember walking back to my fraternity house, which was on Main Street, and everybody just kind of sitting around in stunned silence and really not knowing what to do or how to react to this, which, if I haven't said it already, was the most memorable event of my undergraduate years here at Washington and Lee. So it was well covered by the news media. John Jennings, who was an undergraduate, was broadcasting it live on WREL radio, and it was soon picked up by the CBS affiliate in Roanoke. Philippe Labro, who was also a member of the student body as an exchange student from France, as an undergraduate, relayed the story by phone in his French accent to the United Press Bureau in Richmond for national coverage. And so the nation and as well as Lexington was quite shocked. And of course, the President Gaines postponed the convention indefinitely that night. And as I say, I remember sitting around. I was a young sophomore. I was a member of the New York State delegation at the time, and all the fraternity members were just sitting around in rather stunned silence. So, not knowing whether the convention would resume or not. However, a joint faculty mock convention steering committee unanimously recommended that the convention resume a week later, as it did it was a Monday, I remember, May 7th, I believe, at the urging, interestingly enough, of Mrs. Barclay, who, of course, as the widow, told students that they had unfinished business. Don't let the boys stop this wonderful convention. Senator Barclay wouldn't have wanted it that way. So her insistence on completing the convention was one of several instances, I think, in which she, as a grieving widow, displayed remarkable composure, I guess is one way to express it. One other incident that was, I don't know how widely told, but several hours after the death of her husband had been announced president, Gaines was accompanying her back to Lee House. And as they walked, Gaines said to her that at least her husband was now a servant in the house of the Lord. No, no, she replied. I doubt if he's finished telling St. Peter his stories. So we student delegates under the leadership of convention chairman Carl Swanson returned this next week and finished the business of the convention by nominating Adlai Stevenson on, I believe it was the 5th ballot. But, and I'll continue to remember this image, they left Senator Barkley's chair on the podium empty. So that was the symbol of what he had started and the convention was finishing.
That must have been strange to go back and was there any enthusiasm for it at all?
Yes, well, depends on what you mean by enthusiasm. I think everybody wanted to do it, but was concerned that it would not be the right thing to do in light of his death. But I think that Mrs. Barkley's words and the general feeling was that, you know, if that's what she wanted and if that's what Barkley would have wanted, then we ought to complete the business that had been started.
Interestingly, in 1956, and possibly 1953, I'm not sure about, mock conventions is when research began to be applied and the tradition of accurate predictions began. My understanding, do you know what the conventions were like before that?
No, I have read about them, but I know about the convention since then. But and a lot of research was done to make it as realistic an political exercise as possible. Of course, the mock convention got its reputation for accuracy in 1924 when John W. Davis was nominated. The Democratic convention that year was completely tied up. It won, I believe, 103 ballots. And John W. Davis was in the background, but was a Washington Lee graduate. And the mock convention that year went 23 ballots, as I remember, when students, in essence, said, it is such a tangle, we'll never get it accurate, but why don't we nominate a Washington Lee alumnus who is a prominent person politically on the national scene? So they nominated John W. Davis, and what happened later, Calvin Coolidge was nominated on the 103rd ballot at the actual Democratic convention. So it got its reputation that year, deserved or not, for accuracy in predicting, in projecting, and through realistic research and projections as being the most accurate mock convention in the country. A number of colleges have mock conventions, but I think Washington Lee's total, if my figures are correct, there have been a total of 25 mock conventions, and the accurate forecast has been made 19 of those 25 times. And it's even more impressive if you go back to let's say to my mock convention in 1956. The convention's been right 13 out of 15 times. Only twice have they been wrong. Of course, you can say a lot about, well, it's much easier now given the fact that presidential nominees are known well in advance. And the convention, the political party conventions themselves do not serve the same purpose of actually selecting a candidate as they once did in the early days of our mock convention here. It's determined earlier. The dates have been moved earlier, so now instead of being late April or May, because of primaries serving the main function of having the candidates known usually by February, the mock convention itself is now held in late January or early February. So its function is still to project a candidate for the party out of power. But because the whole nominating process has changed, the Washington Lee mock convention has had to change also, and because the candidates are known much further in advance through what some people call the presidential marathon, with campaigning starting 2 years or more earlier, it does raise the question of how the mock convention should change, and some have even raised the question of whether there should even be mock conventions because of the nature of the nominating process now. But it does have its reputation for accuracy. Students, it is a real political exercise, in addition to being a good party weekend also. I think that is true.
Thinking back to the 50s, because I don't know this, since you've done some reading, on the change that it became a little more serious, a little less of a free-for-all party. Do you have any idea why that evolution took place, or if there was any particular incident that caused that change?
Well, not to my knowledge. Again, my experience goes back only to '56, and it is still much in the same tradition now of being a party weekend in addition to a realistic exercise. The parade is one of the highlights, if not the highlight, I think, of that. And in that respect, in being a party weekend, has not changed, and drastically anyway, I would say, although it's a little more difficult now to get prominent guest speakers, perhaps, than it was then, because of their involvement in the primary nominating system. The weather in January is not as good for a parade as late April or May. But even though the nature of the convention itself has changed, I mean, almost never now go beyond one ballot or two at the most, but it was very unusual to have only one ballot in the mock convention itself because of the nature of the process. And as I said earlier, in '56, Adlai Stevenson was nominated on the fifth ballot. In 1960, John Kennedy was nominated on the sixth ballot. It was the fifth ballot in '64. So it's been only relatively recently, since 1976 or 1980, that first ballot, one ballot only, has been the rule rather than the exception.
I was thinking, actually, real quick, the 1968 convention, that would have been
Nixon.
Nixon,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and it was a Republican convention.
That's correct.
Did the 60s, did the rest of the world touch Washington and Lee? Were there people protesting with the Republican convention in 1968?
To tell you the truth, that was one of the two that I have missed since my graduation. I missed the 1960 convention because I was in graduate school at the time, and 1968, even though I had come back to Washington and Lee, in 1963 I was on a leave of absence for graduate study at Syracuse University. So I know relatively little about the 1968 convention, but there had been a growth in coverage, national media coverage of the conventions. And whether there was in '68 or not, somebody else would have to say.
I've always wondered that if everyone still just wore khaki pants and button-down shirts, or hippies on campus or what. Can you take me sort of step by step through the MockCon process? Like where do they get the money from? Do the students completely control every step, or is administration at all part of it?
In terms of the structure and process of the Mock Convention, it is student organized and run. There is a faculty advisor to that. Professor Bill Connolly is currently and has been for some time now the faculty advisor to the Mock Convention. There is also a board of advisors from outside the university, prominent media people. Larry Sabato, for example, at UVA is on the board. But these individuals and boards provide help, but not direction in terms, if that's a good way to phrase it, in terms of the actual process. Bill Connolly is very familiar, teaches American government, deals with the political process, and the advisors will help students to make contacts for fundraising purposes as well as for organization. But they choose, the students, Student Body Executive Committee, choose the co-chairs, and they're usually 3 student co-chairs of the Mock Convention Committee a couple of years in advance. So they begin their work organizing and making their contacts well in advance. But it is proudly so a student-run organization and event with help and advice from faculty and a board, but with the actual process and work being done well in advance, I might say, of the Mock Convention itself. And of course, all of the students, theoretically anyway, participate in the convention itself through state delegations. There are chairs selected for each state delegation, and they make contacts with not only potential sources of income, but also with politicians and political figures in the state, so that they get the process right and also current political information on how their state is going to come out in the process. Yes, right.
What estimate would you give on the number of students? I mean, is it most of the student body participates?
Yes, I would say well, I can't give a specific figure, but I'd say well over 90% of the student body participate. And this is one event, too, in which law students are actively engaged and play various roles as state chairman of delegations.
Were there any skills
I'm not sure I would say any skills because I was a sophomore at the time and really did not participate in the leadership of the Mont Convention that year. But I will say that my participation and knowing about the Mont Convention did intensify what interest I had in the political process. And in both graduate school, I was an economics major as an undergraduate, but I switched to public affairs and social policy on the graduate school level, and my teaching since coming back to Washington Lee in 1968 has been in the politics department, and so it certainly helped me in terms of stoking my interest, you might say, in the political process, and that's been my life in essence since then.
What specific value do you think the mock convention has, and should it continue on? Do our students get something out of this?
Oh, I think there's no question that they are, and I would say they're getting, it is a realistic political exercise, and I think that it serves a number of purposes in addition to the forecast or prediction of who will be the out-of-power presidential nominee. I think just the leadership that is assumed by the students in this mock convention, the working together of, in essence, all of the students in the student body, and the skills that they gain make this a valuable exercise. This is not to say, of course, that some have not questioned because of the changing nature of the nomination process, whether it does still serve a purpose. And I think you could argue that, or I would anyway, that it serves very important purposes, although not in the same way and to the same extent, perhaps, that the originally the mock convention was formed to promote. So it involves students certainly in the process, but students have adjusted the mechanics and the processes themselves to maintain its realistic nature. So it does not, it still serves the purpose, but not in the same way of projecting the winner of the party's nominating process. But on the other hand, it serves many other purposes, and I, for one, am a strong advocate of continuing to hold a mock convention each 4 years.
Have you been to a political convention?
No, well, at the local level only, but not national, no.
I'm just trying to think of some specifics over the years. How have they evolved or changed? I mean, obviously, technology has made a huge difference.
The basic format, I would say, has not changed. There is, but as you say, the technology, the way a convention is seen nationally, the role the media play is pretty much the same. I mean, has changed significantly, but and the steps in the convention itself have changed, but there is still the emphasis on trying to get speakers of national political fame or infamy to have a series of speakers to have the party system promoted. And again, the dates, for example, of the Monk Convention have changed because of the way the nominating process has changed. But yes, it has changed, but it is still basically the approach, I would argue anyway, is very similar to what it has been historically.
All right, looking over all these conventions you've been to, which ones stand out for you as far as being, there's got to be some moments, other than Alvin Market, there's got to be some great moments that have happened over the years.
Well, many of the conventions themselves have been highlighted by the keynote speaker. As Barclay was the keynote speaker for my undergraduate convention, I remember the talks that have been made by prominent political figures and the messages that they have brought on behalf of their political parties. I think that for example, Jimmy Carter was the keynote speaker here 4 years, I think it was 4 years before he was nominated for president. So it was only in retrospect, perhaps, because he was not a particularly stimulating speaker. But that, in retrospect, was a highlight of the convention in 1972, because he became the convention's, both the convention's nominee and the country's president 4 years later. I might also note that even convention guests are not immune to the festivity and party atmosphere on convention weekends. It's alleged, I don't know this for a fact, but it's alleged that when Carter was here, Jody Powell, who was Carter's press secretary, accompanied Carter here in '72, but he missed his boss's speech altogether, having given in to the temptation offered by a group of students and alumni to play pinball and drink beer at what was then the Central Lunch, instead of attending the talk. And of course, Bill Clinton was here, and he enjoyed partying. In addition to bringing the message, he enjoyed partying at Zalman's Pavilion and playing his saxophone that evening. But in terms of highlights, I really think that the two most, looking at the broad history of conventions, and aside from the party atmosphere, because students are very serious during the convention and in preparing for the convention, I think it's the being involved and seeing how the political process works, but also names who have been here, prominent political figures like Carter and Clinton and Harry Truman and others who have come to Washington and Lee to participate and recognize the significance of the convention itself.
If you were a student trying to persuade one of these speakers to come here, what do you think your argument would be?
To extol the virtues of the prominence that they would enjoy here and the participation in such a realistic process. Although, again, I'm sure Bill Connolly would say this also, that it does get, or has in recent years, gotten more difficult to get prominent speakers, especially those who may be candidates or future candidates here, because they are so involved in the primary process. But I think the exposure that speakers get and the participation in such a significant event are at least some of the reason or the pitch that can be made. Well, I wasn't mentioning money, but yes.
That's not,
No, no.
Would you have any words of advice for current students for the next mock convention? Anything they might consider doing differently?
Not necessarily. What I would suggest by way of advice for students who have already been appointed, some of them anyway, for the planning of the next mock convention, and one is to build on past experience, I think, because I think that the students have done a good job of building on the experience of past years, and there has been a concerted effort made to obtain an accurate record in recent years of what was done and how it was done. But I think from my perspective, the important aspects are to get an early start, to raise as much money as they can, because that they can put on a better show and get better speakers, get more speakers here, the more money they have, and they have done a very good job on that, I might add. But to get an early start, to get the fundraising started early, and to build upon the experience of previous mock conventions.
Is there anything that you want to add? Memories or thoughts?
No, I think other than to say that the mock convention, not only for the reason of what happened at my particular mock convention, was the most memorable experience of my undergraduate years, but even though I was not in a leadership position, just the experience of attending a mock convention was certainly a highlight and intensified my interest in national politics as a result of that. But other than that, no.
Anything else you got, Bruce?
I just wanted to, maybe I get behind you so we're looking in the right direction.
Okay.
That relieves my knees. To cycle back to the beginning again, to just talk about, where were you seated? Were you near the front or in the back there, or?
In the middle. Now, of course, at the mock convention, the seating is by delegation, and they have most of the delegates are seated on the floor itself. As the student body has grown somewhat in size, they have occasionally had to, excuse me, seat delegates in the bleachers. But I was sort of in the middle of the New York State delegation, and frankly, I can't remember how that they were seated, the delegations were seated that particular year, but they again try to mimic the seating of delegations at the national conventions coming up that year.
So how was the view?
The view cannot be hot, but it was hot. No, everybody was on the same level. So it was a lot of peering around the person in front of you and over the top of their head. But of course, the platform was elevated, so there was no problem in seeing that. But